A fellow YouTuber, Silverstruck, put out a video where he introduced us to one of his new acquisitions. It's a large 10-ounce silver round that looks very similar to this piece. And it just reminded me that I have kind of a growing collection of a similar design style to that piece. So I thought it would be interesting to do a little bit of compare and contrast with Silverstruck's new piece that is quite similar, and also talk about some of the other pieces here that fit within this collection, that is the MTB Lady Liberty design. So that's what this video is going to be about. If you are new to this channel, I want to welcome you stopping by. Thank you for being here. If you haven't yet subscribed, I'd like to encourage you to subscribe to this channel. If you are one of my returning subscribers, what can I say, guys? But thank you as always for being with me here again today. If you are new to the channel, I like to begin each of my videos with a simple disclaimer. I am not a financial advisor. I'm not trying to offer any kind of financial advice. I'm simply trying to share some of my experience having bought and sold precious metals and rare coins for the last 30 or 40 years. I also like to begin my videos with a concept or two, if I can, that we can work back into the subject matter. And today I'd like to talk about two different concepts that work kind of hand in hand with what we're looking at here. They are the concept of originality and also the concept of a specimen. So originality really has to do with how pristine a coin is or a piece of bullion is. And it's not just about the surfaces, although those are important too. Originality is a little bit difficult to define, and it's also a little bit esoteric, but I think it really has to do with unmessed with. That would probably be kind of the best descriptor for it. So original surfaces, coins, and even bullion, in my opinion, have very delicate original surfaces. That's one of the reasons why you hear the mantra within coin collecting that we don't clean coins, because cleaning a coin strips away those original surfaces. And original surfaces are an indication that a coin has never been messed with. Once a coin has been messed with, whether it's being cleaned, being wiped, been doctored somehow, it can never be original again. And that originality is kind of an important feature of a coin. The original surfaces can also include tone, and one of the interesting things about Silverstruck's piece is that it's got beautiful tone. He's got a piece that has rainbow colored tone, and I will definitely put a link down below so you can check out his video and take a closer look at it. Tone is kind of an unusual thing. It's almost specific to silver, although gold does tone in certain circumstances. But toning can take on a rainbow color, multiple colors. You can often see toned coins that have greens and blues and yellows and oranges and red, and often they can be quite attractive, and they do add something to a coin. To most collectors, some collectors don't really like tone. The nature of toning, though, is that if we like the color that tone imparts on a coin, then we call it tone. If we don't like that color, we often call it tarnish. So a mottled gray tone on a piece of silver is not really attractive to most people. So it's really kind of a subjective thing. If you like it, it's tone. If you don't like it, it's tarnish. That is an indication of the original surfaces of the coin as well. Some of the other things that can go towards something being original include the packaging that the item comes in. Now, packaging gets to be a little bit cumbersome, especially if you're dealing with mint packaging, United States mint packaging from the 1980s and 1990s. It seems like they had a goal, which was to create the largest, most bulky packing that you can possibly find, and that would be outer sleeves, inner sleeves, a custom box. There could be wrapping around the coin. There's a COA. There's a satchel. It got to the point where it was a little bit ridiculous. But I'd like to say about originality, especially when it comes to packaging, that you can only have those packaging materials once, and once you lose them, and they do get discarded very easily, you can't really get them back again. It's not very easy to, especially if you've literally destroyed them or thrown them away. So while there is a little bit of a give and take between the cumbersome nature of some larger packaging, given the choice, if you are in the market to buy a specific piece of bullion or a coin, and you can have one that has all of its original packaging, or you have one that's just the coin laying there by itself, all other things being equal, which one do you choose? I like to call that White Cross's choice. I would tend to lean more towards the original with the original packaging, because if worst case scenario, you can always throw those pieces away if you wanted to, and you're still left with an original coin versus that piece that's just there by itself. Certificates of authenticity, also a little bit of originality. COA is what we usually call them. So if you've come across that term before and weren't quite sure what it is, certificate of authenticity is usually just a very small document that indicates who made the piece, when it was made, what it is made from, including its purity if it's made out of precious metals. Sometimes they will include the number of a piece. So some pieces are issued sometimes in very limited release, and it can have a serial number on it as well. The signature of a dignitary, of official of the mint or the business that made that piece. So those COAs can be important as well. And then there's also often just a little bit of extra that comes along with it that really does define the originality of packaging. I know this is kind of a strange tangent to get off on, but since we're talking about it, we might as well. There are often little pieces of ephemera that go along with packing materials, and sometimes it can be the associated catalog that came along with the piece, or it can be a mailer that mentioned the piece when it was first released by the mint or whatever organization that released it. That gets to be a little bit of a gray area as well, but I tend to think that those pieces add something to it. Think about it in terms of a classic car. If you're looking at a beautiful classic car and the sales brochure from the year that the car came out is lying in the front seat, you have to admit that's kind of a neat feature. And I kind of think of this ephemera stuff as the same thing. The more complete it can be, it's a little bit tedious and it's a little bit cumbersome. But again, White Cross's choice, I think most people would be drawn towards the thing that had the most original features along with it. Again, you can always discard them if you wanted to. So that's originality, and we'll talk about that specifically as in terms that as it relates to Silverstruck's piece. And I mentioned the final term that I wanted to introduce here is the term of specimen. Specimen is a little bit of a gray area as well. This is kind of a new development in the world of numismatics. And for a long time, coins have been either business strike or proof strike. Proof, especially prepared planchet, that's a blank that the coin is struck on. Specially prepared dies, those are the hearted pieces of metal that come together to strike the front and the back, the obverse and reverse of the coin. Often those dies have special polish to them. Sometimes these pieces are struck multiple times, and often they are struck with more force than the business strike. Those are the pieces that we would spend from a series. Those pieces often, when we think about proof, we immediately think of something that has this kind of black and white cameo, that mirrored finish on it is what most of us think of as proof. But proofs can come in different styles. They don't just happen to be those deep cameo mirrored proof that we got kind of used to in the 20th century. Earliest part of the 20th century, we released coins that had proofs that were matte finish, so almost kind of a dusty look to them, or a satin finish, which kind of sounds like what it is. They kind of a nice shimmery sheen to them, but they weren't highly reflective. So it doesn't have to be mirrored to be a proof. It can be a matte finish, it can be a satin finish, it can be many other different types. We just don't encounter them quite as often. But the reason I'm talking about that is that the term specimen often refers to coins that are somewhere on that continuum between business strike and what we would call like a super fancy mirrored proof. They are still leaning more towards proof than business strike. Like I said, this is a continuum. But some of the examples that the Mint has put out in the last 20 or 30 years are specimens. And let me show you a couple of examples here. There's the 1994 Jefferson nickel. This was part of the Botanic Gardens set, I believe. And you can tell the surfaces of this coin just look a little bit different. That's a good way to describe it. They're not deeply polished. This is not really reflective, but there's something to it that just looks a little bit different from maybe a business strike nickel. This is a specimen. Another example would be the 1998 Kennedy half dollar. This is another example of a specimen. You can see here the SP next to the grade that's given to this slabbed piece. So the reason I bring this up is because I think that Silverstruck's piece has what I would call a specimen finish to it. And that's one of the other things that I think is interesting. We'll talk about that a little bit again later. So you've got a couple concepts to play with, the concept of originality, the concept of a specimen. Let's talk a little bit about the pieces that you see here in front of you as I drone on and on like I always do. So Manfra, Toredella, and Brookes, they are an enormous precious metals company based in Manhattan. And by enormous, I mean they are huge. They don't sell precious metals to individuals. This is not a mom and pop shop. They actually sell precious metals to sovereign countries. So if you are a sovereign country, let's say the United States of America, England, or Mexico, and you are putting out gold or silver coins, you have to source that material from somewhere. And this needs to be somewhere that can understand supply chain issues with the enormous number of pieces that you might be striking. So this is the type of business that MTB would do. They would service international sovereign nations and supply them the precious metals they need for their minting programs. Also, huge corporations, for whatever reasons, that need precious metals might come to Manfra, Toredella, and Brookes. They also do some minting themselves. So they do actually take the raw materials and turn it into coins in the right circumstances. And they also offer vault services. So if you are a larger customer that needs to hold physical precious metals for whatever reasons, they would hold it for you in insurance against loss. So this, you can tell, this is a big company. But it's interesting that they actually sold to consumers in the 1980s. This was a burgeoning market. I've talked all the time about the run-up in 1980 that the Hunt brothers had when they kind of cornered the silver market. And after that, all eyes seemed to be on precious metals for many, many years. And MTB, I think, understood that. And they knew that the average consumer who was interested in holding precious metals might be interested in holding something that had a little bit of panache to it, a little bit of flash, a little bit of substance. I think it kind of relates a little bit to the silver art bars from the early 1970s, and you'll definitely see that on some of the pieces that I talk about here. Incidentally, MTB is now a subsidiary of Pamp Swiss. So if that name sounds familiar, this is one of the bars that Costco has been selling recently. They are a perennial favorite. Pamp is a really well-known name in precious metals. So it kind of makes sense that MTB is now fully owned by Pamp Swiss. Silverstruck's 10-ounce round. Let's talk a little bit about his piece. And again, I'll put a link down below so you can take a look at his video. I think it's a really fascinating piece for many reasons. First off, his piece was struck by Johnson Matthey. Johnson Matthey, one of the most important names in minting precious metals, especially for that consumer market that we talked about in the 1980s. They were founded in London in 1817 by a man named Percival Norton Johnson. I love that name. Anybody named Percival is all right in my book. In 1851, George Matthey decided to join the firm, and that's when it became Johnson Matthey. So this is a firm that's been in London for at least 200 years now. They were one of the 5 families that set the London afternoon gold fix for the better part of 100 years. These 5 families, I call them families, it sounds almost like it's The Godfather. These were really kind of big bullion firms in London who would get together twice a day on most weekdays, and they would discuss what their buy and sell orders were in order to determine what the official going price of gold was. So they met twice a day for many, many years, many decades. Johnson Matthey was one of those. The other names included in that was Rothschild and Son, Pixley and Abel, Sharps and Wilkins, and there's another one that is Makata and Goldschmidt. And if that sounds familiar, you may have seen Makata and Goldschmidt's name on my channel a few times. They were also one of the 5 families that got together. So Johnson Matthey has a very long history going back with bullion, at least 200 years. At this period of time, they were one of the best known recognized names selling consumer bullion. So it makes sense that MTB would have contracted with them. So Silverstruck's piece made by Johnson Matthey, I think that's really neat. I think that's kind of one of the things that I like about his piece. What else do I like about that piece of Silverstruck's? Well, it's originality, right? I talked about originality at the beginning of this video. His piece has beautiful tone, and I think that that is a factor of its originality. That means this piece has not been cleaned harshly. It hasn't been wiped. Nobody's tried to get rid of that tone or tarnish, however you prefer to call it. So I think that that lends a little bit of originality to his piece. It also comes with the original box. He's got the original COA. You can see how this is ticking off all of those boxes that I talked about when it came to originality. He also has one of those kind of strange pieces of ephemera that came along with the piece. And if you watch the video, you'll see it's a clear plastic piece that fits snugly over the coin inside the lid, I believe. And what makes that interesting is that that's the kind of thing that was often discarded. People would have opened that box up and seen that and thought it was packing material, like literally bubble wrap from this period of time, and they would have thrown it away. The fact that he still has this piece lends more originality to this piece. It really kind of makes this piece likely one of the most original survivors that's out there. But more importantly is the fact that this piece provides a Goldilocks environment for that coin, medallion, whatever you want to call it. That piece of plastic fits snugly over the coin, but not so snugly that it can't allow the coin to interact with its environment. By environment, I mean not just the packaging, but literally the air around it. So a Goldilocks region where that coin was exposed to a little bit of oxygen that allowed it to tone, but not enough oxygen that it caused it to tone darkly or unattractively. You can see where I get the Goldilocks term from. And I think that's something really special. I think that, like I said, that probably makes this one of the most original examples that still remains out there. Somebody had the foresight to keep that little silly piece of plastic, but that adds originality to the piece, and I think that that's really cool. And finally, I think the surfaces of his coin are arguably specimen. I think it is that SP designation that we talked about earlier. The specimen is kind of specially prepared surface. You can tell that his piece has got a little bit of a specialness to it. And we've got an example. Let's take one of these pieces here. This is a round made from this same period of time. We'll talk about these in just a moment. But you see, this is kind of a muted luster piece. It's not designed to be a mirrored proof like this piece. And it's not your typical high luster piece like this Engelhardt. You see those radiant cartwheel spokes on this piece. A little bit more muted on this example with the Statue of Liberty on it. So it's my opinion that his piece is probably technically a specimen finish. And I think that makes it interesting. Now, it's very likely and even possible and even likely, that all of the pieces from that series have that same finish. I would be perfectly willing to accept that. But there's something that just looks really nice about the surfaces of that 10-ounce silver piece. And I think that that's one of the most interesting things about it as well. Here's that specimen term that we talked about. Let's talk a little bit about some of these other pieces that you see here. So we've got some rounds here. I mentioned these before. These are from the same period of time. This is an MTB round from 1985. Statue of Liberty, very important focal point in this period of time. Statue of Liberty started being built in 1876, right? That's the centennial of the United States of America, but it wasn't dedicated until 1886. So 1985, 1986, this became kind of a hot topic. This was something, especially for an organization that was based in Manhattan, this would have been on the tips of everybody's tongues. They all would have been talking about the rehabilitation of Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty. For those of you who are old enough to remember it, it wasn't quite as spectacular as the bicentennial from 10 years earlier, but it wasn't entirely unlike that either. So there was a lot of that kind of celebratory issuing of medals and those kind of special events going on. So it makes sense that these pieces kind of reflect that, and I think that that's probably the genesis of these pieces where they came from. The 1-ounce pieces. There were two that we know of. It's very possible that there are more. These pieces look very similar. This piece that I was just holding. You can flip it over, and you can see the MTB trademark right there. But across from it, we see this small trademark here. Do you recognize that? Yeah, that's the Johnson Matthey trademark. Those are the crossed hammers of Johnson Matthey. So this piece was actually made for MTB by Johnson Matthey. You come across these pieces occasionally, and there are pieces that look very similar to them, but are not the ones that are made by JM or anybody else of name. And if you see them, you might want to take a double take at them and maybe consider picking them up. I just looked at eBay right before I started shooting this video, and these pieces are currently selling for about $50 a piece. I'm fortunate that pretty much everything you see here, I bought at Melt of 10, 15, 20 years ago when silver was in that $10 range. So I'm sitting in pretty good shape for these pieces, but about $50 a piece for that. They are similar to this piece here, but you can see that this piece has a little bit of a different motto right there. And if you flip this piece over, you'll find that this piece has a different mint mark right there. Do you see that? That is the Engelhard mint mark. So Engelhard, the maker of the Prospectors, also made this 10-ounce bar that we'll talk about momentarily. So MTB was having pieces made for it by both Johnson Matthey and Engelhard. And there's more. I think that that's really interesting. The Engelhard piece is currently selling on eBay in the $60 range, so they're maybe even a little bit more expensive than the JM pieces. I think that there is a little bit more of a rabid fan base for all things Engelhard. I count myself in that fan base. Next up, we have a couple 1-ounce bars. These 1-ounce bars, just about as interesting as the 1-ounce coins, I think. It's a beautiful design. You can see it's really, really similar to the 10-ounce of the same style. This 1-ounce bar definitely has that proof finish, right? There's no question about this being a specimen finish. This is definitely a mirrored proof finish. But if you flip the piece over, you see that this piece also has the MTB name all over it and the logo, and that JM mark. So this bar, also made by Johnson Matthey, I think that's really neat. This is a great example of supply and demand, because even though these pieces are currently commanding, and again, I checked right before I went on started filming this, the 1-ounce pieces, the 1-ounce bars, anywhere between $60 and $100 a piece right now. That seems quite high, especially when you consider the fact that these are not especially rare. AllEngelhard.com says that these pieces struck by Johnson Matthey were struck in quantities of about 100,000 before they decided to start striking them with a letter on the serial number. And I'm not sure if you can see it here. This serial number begins with a small c. That's an indication that this piece was struck after they had already struck 100,000 pieces. They went on to strike another 27,000 of these, I believe. So this is not an especially rare bar from this period of time, and yet it still claims a really high premium that is 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 times its silver value. So we're not talking about a premium in terms of percentages or a premium in percentage in terms of dollars. We're literally talking about multiples of the silver contained within. Supply and demand. There are a lot of Engelhard collectors out there, a lot of JM collectors out there. This is kind of an iconic style bar that kind of harkens back to that Wall Street greed is good era. So it's not surprising that these pieces would be commanding a premium. But the fact that they're commanding a premium that is literally 4 or 5 times their silver value is a little bit unexpected. It is an iconic bar. It's an affordable bar if you want to have a piece in your collection. Definitely take care of these pieces if you've got an example. And you may be thinking that this is the exact same bar here, and you're not too far off. This one with a little bit of tone. I happen to think that that tone is attractive. Some people may not. Very similar bars, but when you flip this piece over, you see that it doesn't have that same JM hallmark down below. What it has is a little bit of a ghostly MA. That's a little bit hard to see there. Can you make that out? Do you know what that MA stands for? Raise your hand. Right, that stands for Medallic Arts Company, or MACO. Medallic Arts Company was originally founded in Manhattan, so it makes sense that MTB would have contracted with them to make these pieces as well. Medallic Arts, a long history going back, I believe, to the 1940s, and I've shown some examples of some of their larger silver pieces in the past, and I'll put a link down to that video below as well. They actually moved from Manhattan to Danbury, Connecticut, then they moved out to Sioux Falls, and then they finally ended in Nevada before they eventually went bankrupt in 2018. We're very fortunate that the ANA was able to purchase most of their materials, so most of their dyes, most of their plaster maquettes, and pretty much everything, all the ephemera that went along with it. And those pieces can now be studied via the ANA. I think that's kind of neat. But sure enough, Medallic Arts actually was one of the makers of these pieces, these Lady Liberty series for MTB. Interestingly, there is anecdotal evidence, at least, to suggest that Medallic Arts, was the first one to make them. So it actually predates the ones that were made by Engelhard and Johnson Matthey. Interesting. I don't think they command quite as big a premium. Again, there's that supply and demand. There just aren't as many people who collect Medallic Arts pieces as there are people who want Johnson Matthey or Engelhard. Next up, we've got this 10-ounce bar. This is kind of a neat one. I was very fortunate that back in the day, and I'm talking about the 1990s and early 2000s, I was buying silver like this anytime that I can find it in its original packaging. There's that originality that we talked about again. So that's why you can see that I'm a kind of a fan of it. This is one of those pieces that I bought, stuck into a safety deposit box, and really didn't think much about it for about 20 years. It turns out that these pieces are on fire right now. They literally hurt my hand to hold. That's how much they're selling for. This piece has that little Engelhard mark. So we know that this is a 10-ounce bar of this MTB series, and you can see that it's made for and sold by MTB. You've got the little MTB logo down there. This is considered by all Engelhard to be a second-tier bar. All Engelhard rates products, historic products from Engelhard and other refineries, based on the quantities that they believe were made. And they believe that there are fewer than 7,500 of these bars made. That's a very, very small quantity for kind of a little bit later period Engelhard piece. Interestingly, and I talked about the Engelhard example, or Johnson Matthey example, rather, of the 1-ounce piece. This is not the only version that Johnson Matthey struck for MTB. There were actually 5 or 6 other versions that were sold to regional banks, I believe. And I'll put a picture of one of those here so you can see what it looks like. The front was the same, the obverse, if you will. The back actually had the individual bank's name on it. So in addition to the 100,000, 125,000 pieces that were struck by JM for MTB, they struck many, many thousands of extra of these pieces for these regional banks. I think that adds a little bit of interest. But again, it expands the number of pieces out there. And yet these pieces still do command a premium. So the 10-ounce bar that I was just talking about, 7,500, they believe that's, all Engelhard believes that's the figure of the pieces that were made currently on eBay. And there are a few examples of these out on eBay. They're selling for between $600 and $1,000 a piece. So again, silver in that's, let's say, theoretical $25 an ounce range, a 10-ounce bar should have about $250 worth of silver in it. And they're selling for $600 to $1,000. Not just percentages for the premiums, but multiples of the silver value contained within. I'd like to think that this piece is a little bit special, may command those highest of the higher premiums because of its originality. It's still in the original vinyl flip in which it was sold. And then we got a few other examples over here that I'll talk about really briefly before we do a little bit of compare and contrast with Silverstruck's piece. So if you've been looking at this piece, you've probably been thinking the same thing that I have, and that these pieces are identical. They are, right? That's pretty identical. This is kind of an unusual situation. This is an example of the United States of America Platinum Eagle. This is actually a quarter eagle. But this piece was first released in 1997. 1997. These pieces came out in 1985. So it's unusual for the mint to have struck a piece that resembles so closely a privately made piece. We have instances where that kind of goes in reverse. It's not uncommon at all to see silver rounds that have the Morgan dollar or the seated Liberty dollar design on them, the Buffalo nickel design on them. So it's not unusual for them to go from the U.S. mint-produced design to a private design. But in my opinion, it looks awfully similar. And we know that the designer of this piece was also working hand-in-hand with the United States Mint. So the question is, which came first? This is an example of the 1988 $5 gold piece. You know, I'm a big fan of these modern commemorative dollars, or $5 gold pieces contain as much gold as the classic pre-1933 $5 gold pieces. You can often find these at very, very low premium. But this is also a very similar design, but not quite as closely mimicking that design that we saw on the MTB pieces compared to the platinum pieces. I just thought it was an interesting comparison of the two. So let's get to the good stuff finally. This is that 10-ounce round of mine to compare with Silverstruck's piece. And you can see immediately that while I think his piece has that special, that specimen surfaces to it, this piece definitely has that classic mirrored black and white, and it looks a little bit like it's scuffed here. This is a really thin plastic container that this piece is sitting in, and believe me, when I take it out, there are very few scuffs, if any, on it. This is a really immaculate piece to be as old as it is, and you can see it actually says Centennial. That's a reference to the 100th anniversary of the dedication of the Statue of Liberty. But the interesting thing about this piece, and there are at least two besides the differences in surface, is when you flip it over, it doesn't have an Engelhard or Johnson Matthey or even a Medallic Arts hallmark on it. It's got this hallmark. Do you recognize that? That's the hallmark of the Mexico City Mint, the oldest mint in the Americas. This piece was actually struck by the Mexico City Mint for MTB. So now we have at least 4 organizations that were producing this consumer-based bullion for MTB. I think that's really interesting. There may be other examples out there. Certainly, if you've got another example made by somebody else, let me know. I'd like to hear about it. But one of the other things that is interesting about this piece in comparison to silver strucks is this. You see where it says 0.9999? We talk about millesimal fineness a lot on this channel. That's kind of the decimal point purity of a piece of bullion. We can talk about it being 99.9%, but that's percentage, right? That's not millesimal. Millesimal is the decimal points. And it's very unusual in the 2020s to find a millesimal fineness for silver, at least, that is 4 nines pure. We just don't see that very often. But if you're going back to the 1980s, to the mid-1980s, that is very unusual. I've had a hard time kind of trying to come up with any other silver bullion product from this era that was 4 nines fine. I just can't think of any. By all means, again, if you've got another example that predates this one, let me know. But I think 4 nines is a pretty unusual thing. And I don't think the rest of these pieces are 4 nines. In fact, I'm almost positive that they are 3 nines. That was the standard. It is still kind of is the standard for silver in the 2020s. So to see something going back 35 years to be 4 nines fine, Mexico City was on the ball. And I have talked a lot about the fact that I believe the Mexican Mint was really the forerunners of a lot of our modern bullion. I will include some links to those videos down below if you'd like to take a deeper dive into Mexico's mint and their silver products. So there we go. Some interesting compares and contrasts with the MTB Lady Liberty design, a popular design, still popular, obviously, by those prices that they're bringing on eBay, for pieces that were minted 30, 35 years ago. I think it's an interesting lesson in history. It's an interesting lesson in the development of the consumer silver market. Remember, before the 1980s, most people had probably never seen pure silver before. It just wasn't something that was out there. So these are kind of the early stages in making this a market that the average consumer would understand and appreciate. Obviously, they're being made very palatable by having beautiful images on it, harkening back a little bit to those silver art bars from the early 1970s. But I think taking this to a different level. MTB Lady Liberty designs. If you've got any questions about any of the pieces that I've talked about here today, by all means, leave a question down below and I'll see if I've got the knowledge to answer it. I'd like to say that if you've got a question about something, there's a very good chance that somebody else has that question too. Maybe we can answer it for everybody. If you would like to see a deeper dive on any of these pieces, or if there are other subjects within the world of precious metals or rare coins that you'd like to see me do a video or even a video series on, leave a comment down below, and again, I'll see if I've got the expertise and the examples so we can dive deeper into that as well. If you have not yet subscribed to the channel, here's the opportunity. Go ahead and subscribe. Like the video also. That pushes it out through YouTube's algorithms to other people who might be interested in the same type of topic. And as always, thank you for allowing me to be a part of your journey as you go deeper into the world of coins and physical precious metals.